This is America, and right now, American leadership is being put to the test. The U.S. is moving forward in Iran, but not everyone is moving along with it, and rivals are paying close attention. So, what does this mean for the U.S.'s global role, and who stands to benefit? I'll be back later in the program with more on that, but first, Anna Burns-Francis.
Thanks, Manny. It's fair to say America's allies are feeling a little put out by the president's recent overseas entanglements, starting a war without consulting them and then calling on them for help. But does he need them, or do they need him? Shortly we'll go to the White House with our chief US correspondent, Alan Fisher. Heidi Jo Castro joins us from the State Department, and with the latest developments from the United Nations is Kristen Salumi in New York. It's becoming clear America has no good options left to get out of the war with Iran. But what's worse than having no off-ramp? Having no allies.
And I want you to remember that we said this. They didn't come to our rescue. Now they all want to help. When they're annihilated, the other side is annihilated, they said, we'd love to send ships. They actually made a statement, a couple of them, that we want to get involved when the war's over. No, it's supposed to get involved when the war's beginning, or even before it begins.
Now, no one is suggesting Trump has lost his friends across the pond forever. But relationships were already strained before Donald Trump launched a war that sent oil and energy prices soaring.
We acted immediately, surprised by an American ally who remains an ally, but who is becoming increasingly unpredictable and doesn't even bother to inform us when they decide to launch military operations. It has an impact on our security. It has an impact on our interests.
The president's clearly feeling a little prickly with his partners in Asia as well.
Better about surprise than Japan. Okay? Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor?
All right, let's go now to our chief US correspondent, Alan Fisher, first. He joins us from the White House. Alan, President Trump seems particularly irritated with his allies and their lack of willingness to help, but at the same time rather dismissive of whether he actually needs that help.
Well, he's never really had a great regard for NATO, even in his first term. He was very dismissive of the benefits of the alliance, and of course, he pushed them to boost their defence spending, saying that America for too long had carried the heavy burden. He talked about cutting back on US forces in various countries where they've been allies in the past. And then during this term, of course, there was a lot of talk last year, we all remember it, when Donald Trump was talking about taking over Greenland and wouldn't rule out the possibility of taking it by force. Just to be clear, that was Donald Trump, the American president, suggesting that he would take over the territory of a NATO ally by force. Well, many of the allies this time round were concerned that Donald Trump seemed to jump into the war without any recognition that he may need allies, without any acknowledgement that he was going to do this. And they are concerned that now they're being asked to foot the bill of a war that they never asked for and were never asked to join in with.
All right, let's bring in Heidi Jo Castro here at the State Department. Heidi, it is fair to say the administration is still making some effort, though, at outreach.
Absolutely. And just as Alan said, this was a continuation of the stress on these relationships between the U.S. and its allies, first with NATO funding, then Greenland, and now the Iran war. But the major difference here is that the U.S. does not have the apparent upper hand here. European allies have rebuffed the president's request to send warship to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. And the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was just in Paris trying to make that pitch again. Whether he was successful, we still don't know, but he tried to assuage allies' concerns, saying that this war would last, quote, weeks, not months. Then he told reporters after the meeting that the allies thanked him for the U.S.'s other military interventions that Rubio says benefited the global order.
Times about thanking America for the role we played in trying to bring peace in Sudan. The recognition that the president played a key role in ending what was happening in Gaza. Recognition of the role we've played in stabilizing Syria. Recognition, despite what they may have said in the press, that what we did in Venezuela was good for the world and good for our region in the Western Hemisphere. A recognition of the role we've played in setting up, along with others like Canada, the gang suppression force in Haiti. So, and appreciation for the mediating role we've tried to play in this war between Russia and Ukraine.
This G7 meeting also discussed Russia and Ukraine's war, and the Ukrainian foreign minister reportedly met with Rubio on the sidelines, in which he emphasized that this war with Iran is only benefiting Russia, making the argument that Moscow and Tehran are working together, according to the Ukrainian foreign minister, to prolong this conflict between the U.S. and Iran.
It's a difficult balancing act, isn't it? Swinging at friends left, right and centre has left America looking a little isolated on the world stage, and that is now giving rise to the question, is there someone waiting in the wings? And if so, who is it? Let's go to Kristen Salumi, who's at the United Nations. Kristen, there are a couple of countries in particular that seem to be leveraging off this situation.
Yes, I think that is safe to say. What we're seeing here at the United Nations is two countries, China and Russia, on the one hand, benefiting politically and also economically from the conflict, while at the same time trying to keep a little distance from it. Let me explain. We recently had a Security Council resolution here that was tabled by Bahrain on behalf of Gulf Arab states and Jordan. It was supported by the United States, and it condemned Iran's attacks on neighboring countries, but it didn't condemn the United States or Israel's attacks. And we saw China and Russia seize on that as an opportunity to criticize the United States' conduct, especially the strike that hit a school in Tehran. And in doing so, China was able to paint itself as the impartial arbiter of international law. Russia, recently in the spotlight for its indiscretions against Ukraine, was able to deflect some of that attention away from them. And at the same time, they didn't actually veto the resolution, and the U.S. criticized them as being, quote, Iran's partners. That may be, in fact, because they're benefiting economically. Russia's sanctions, oil sanctions have been loosened, and China, for its part, is also selling technology, according to experts, to Iran that it needs for the war.
Kristen, thank you. Kristen Salumi joining us from the United Nations in New York. Heidi Jo Castro at the State Department and our chief US correspondent, Alan Fisher, at the White House. With the conflict in the Middle East about to enter its second month, the political landscape around the world is shifting. As Donald Trump struggles to convince longtime allies to join his campaign against Iran, it's bringing those who oppose the war closer together and creating opportunities. Here's Richard Gaisford.
A lot of media.
It's quickly become a war of unintended consequences for the US administration, creating friction between alliances and opportunities for those outside of them, reinforcing Donald Trump's negative view of NATO.
And I'll say it publicly, we're very disappointed with NATO because NATO has done absolutely nothing.
Order, order.
Long-forged friendships and special relationships are being tested as allies keep their distance.
But this is not our war, and we are not getting dragged into this war.
And that angers the president.
But I think he did something that was shocking. He didn't want to help us.
It's always been the State Department that rolls out the red carpet and acts as the guardian of US alliances and relationships around the world. But Donald Trump is doing diplomacy in a different way. His immediate thoughts and needs are now forming a framework for foreign policy that in the past would have taken decades to shape. Gulf states now find themselves facing retribution from Iran after the American and Israeli action. Iranian drones and missiles damaging oil and gas infrastructure, unsettling residents, and questioning a long-held belief that the US would be able to protect its Arab allies.
Thank you so much.
As foreign ministers from the G7 leading economies gathered in France, it seems European nations are working more closely together as they pull back from the US.
Unser Ziel ist klar. Our goal is clear, and on this I agree with my British and French colleague.
There's frustration in European capitals and in Ukraine that Donald Trump has temporarily released sanctions on Russian oil, giving Vladimir Putin a cash boost for his war machine. China sits back and watches, also not getting directly involved, as India now uses the Chinese yuan to buy its Russian oil. That's raising long-term questions about the dominance of the US dollar. Also, the strength of the US commitment to allies in Southeast Asia, all suffering the effects of a cut in oil supply, whilst watching American military assets being moved away from them towards the Middle East. As leaders around the world are saying their own country's interests are more important than joining a US-led conflict, the president warns he won't forget those who haven't stepped up. Richard Gaisford, Al Jazeera, Washington.
As we've been hearing, the US is facing growing backlash on the global stage for its war in Iran, making it a hot topic in the media here as well. Let's head back to Mani Rapalo in the newsroom.
That question over U.S. leadership is really coming into focus when you view how the rest of the U.S. news media is viewing this changing relationship between the United States and its allies around the world. Let's go to the New York Times. They cut straight to the point. Trump's recklessness will haunt us for a generation. We're quoting David French here, opinion writer, who goes on to say, it's really important for people to understand that he, President Trump, is breaking things you can't fix. One of the things he's breaking is our relationship with our NATO allies. Now, this idea of NATO allies questioning U.S. leadership, that's nothing new. We've heard that story. But there are some in the U.S. news media sphere who argue that pushing NATO aside is the strategy as the U.S. seeks to strengthen its alliances in Asia. This is CNN political commentator Brad Todd.
I think his best prospects are in Asia. South Korea currently gets 70% of their oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Japan gets 40%. We have 50,000 troops in Japan and 35,000 in South Korea. The Japanese Prime Minister today implied that perhaps they could come and help patrol the Strait. I think that's really where our alliance will end up being on this project. And I think Europe's going to look really weak and irrelevant when they do.
Let's head over to Politico. This headline suggests something different from Europe. Top U.S. allies are turning toward China instead. The article goes on to read, as Washington and its allies grow more estranged, the perception of the U.S. as the dominant world power is in retreat, though most Americans don't see it that way. But let's head on over to The Economist, who have this cover story titled Blind Fury. The article argues the conflict in Iran is benefiting another U.S. adversary, Russia, by diverting attention and U.S. military resources away from Ukraine. The article goes on to say, in Moscow, Mr. Putin is laughing. But what about U.S. alliances with Gulf countries? We can turn to foreign policy, which has this article describing that relationship as a fundamental reshaping of those alliances, adding that, quote, the war has exposed vulnerabilities in the alliance framework that will not be forgotten when the fighting stops. Now, geopolitical speculation aside, there's another school of thought that suggests that all of this is part of a grand strategy by President Trump. Let's head on over to Fox News for a bit of that perspective.
I'm not saying you have to agree with everything Trump's doing as the commander-in-chief. I get it. You don't have to agree with the way we went to war, but once you're in it, you got to be in it to win it. And you have to understand there's a huge payoff if we're victorious.
What will that payoff be? That part remains unclear. What is clear is that this is a moment that could define U.S. leadership for years to come. It's also clear that this war isn't only shaping how the world views the U.S., but how the U.S. views its role in the world.
All right, a complicated geopolitical quagmire, it may seem. Joining me now to hopefully try and make sense of it all is PJ Crowley, former Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, and Bradley Jardine, Managing Director at Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs. Thank you both for coming in. PJ, I should say, rather. I'll start with you. Is the US breaking up with its allies or just having a break?
I think we're having a break. If you look over time, there have been strains. It can be a roller coaster. A lot will depend on world events. Think back to the Iraq War, significant strains, particularly with our allies in Europe. But then, the world came together for the financial crisis, got back together, significant cooperation, and things were calm. So a lot will depend on how this ends, and a lot will depend on the choice that the United States makes, say, in 2028.
In lieu, Bradley, of that event that we can't forecast yet that may bring the world back together, was this war a catalyst for that real fracturing of those relationships?
I don't think this war has been the major catalyst. It's of course another strain, but I think it's a cumulative strain on what we've been seeing under this current administration. I mean, large strains, of course, of an existential issue being the European conflict in Ukraine with Russia. That's, of course, first priority for Europeans and for much of NATO, the first order issue. And so I think that issue and kind of inconsistencies from this administration with regard to Russia has been something that's been putting severe strains on this relationship dynamic.
Yeah, I want to get to that in a moment. PJ, when we look back at the broader relationship the US has, what has been impacted more, its relationship with those allies or its influence that it has in those relationships?
I think the world is trying to figure out, how much of this is based on Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And Trump's instinct is to be unpredictable. And when you think about alliances,
good for your enemies, but not so good for your friends.
Exactly right. You want to be particular. You want to be clear. And Trump is a guy, he can have a policy today, he can contradict himself tomorrow. So the world is kind of wondering, in the context of Donald Trump, what does he want from us? But then, is this just about a unique political figure like Donald Trump, or is this a choice that America's making where it's no longer interested in being the leader of the so-called free world, and the world, and particularly America's allies, have to make some fundamental adjustments as they look into the future?
Yeah, talking of fundamental adjustments, long-standing allies and neighbours like Canada definitely see the relationship with the United States as forever changed.
This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited.
Bradley, as you saw there, already a fundamental range of differences over tariffs, over the war in Ukraine, over what happens to Greenland. And I'm wondering if perhaps there was an element that the US had not really assessed fully the impact of those disagreements with its allies before it went to war with Iran.
I think that's definitely the case. There's been a lot of growing tensions, as I had mentioned, with the situation in Ukraine. Also with regard to Greenland, the threats to Greenland, to a NATO ally, of course, has sparked a lot of conversation, a lot of worries across NATO. And so, of course, when tariffs are being used as a form of leverage or coercion by a hegemonic actor such as the United States, that does lead naturally to a lot of questions about the durability of depending on the United States for security. Does it mean a large rupture of decoupling entirely from the US in the long run? Not really. I think it'll be a slow process where actors look for alternatives. They might work together more closely to de-risk the relationship with the United States.
You mentioned that reliability of the US. PJ, we keep hearing this message, particularly from the last couple of days, Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying the United States has given and given and given, and it's not getting back from its allies. Is that fair? Is that accurate?
To some extent, you think about the context of NATO, for example, it's been by design.
Yes.
The United States always wanted to be the dominant player in NATO. It is a good idea, the way that Trump has gone about pushing Europe to spend more on defense, that's actually a constructive element. Mm-hmm. How he's gone about doing that is highly destructive, and has created unnecessary tensions. And so I do think that there are just these questions accumulating around the world. How reliable is the United States as an ally? And we're in the midst of one crisis. There'll be others where the world will see some answers that will have some long-term implications.
We've talked a lot about European allies, Bradley. Does the influence or the relationship, is it as structurally important with the likes of Japan?
Yes, of course. I mean, one of the big issues with this conflict is that, one, in addition to with NATO allies, there's been lack of consultation, thinking through what the real risks would be. When you look at East Asia, the structural risks have been huge. They're far more dependent on these energy supplies that are coming through the Straits of Hormuz. And this has had serious ramifications for their economies. Of course, we've also seen defensive posturing as the US is moving clear strategic assets from East Asia, where long-standing US strategy is to increase its defensive posture in the Asia-Pacific it seems to be reversing that. This is worrying allies in Asia about the dependability about the US in a crisis, or whether the US can actually sustain conflicts in multiple theaters as we're seeing unfold.
Yeah, you have already mentioned other actors coming into play here. Almost as soon as the meeting of G7 leaders finished, Britain's foreign minister was pointing the finger not just at Iran, but at Russia too.
We have also seen support from Russia provided to Iran in the Middle East conflict as well. And that is why I think as G7 countries we have a shared interest in coming together to discuss these issues.
PJ, one of the big talking points has been the lifting of those US sanctions on Russian oil. Bad for Europe and Ukraine, but you've got to think wholly good for Russia and its ability to finance the conflict.
Absolutely, and I think that's a lightning bolt, across Europe, for example, taking the pressure off of Russia, even while the Ukraine conflict continues to go on. It gets at this aspect of what is fundamental to basic alliances. It is unity of purpose, it is clarity of action, and that is now in tatters, and you're going to have to reconstruct that if all sides agree that there's still value in these alliances.
Help me understand, does it help Russia's geopolitical influence as well in the broader region?
Absolutely. Anytime you take pressure off of Putin, or even anytime you take pressure weirdly off of Iran by temporarily lifting sanctions on its oil supplies, you remove that pressure point and it gives greater freedom of action for someone who is ostensibly, an adversary.
Bradley, can we look at the role of China? They are notoriously pragmatic, and they seem to be maintaining that line, fairly reserved so far in this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, China's relationships in the Middle East are very complex. It's been for decades trying to bridge the gulf between Saudi Arabia and Iran, their rivalrous, ambitions for dominance in the region. So China's still taking a back seat at the moment, but of course it's been hit in the short term with its energy. It's very dependent, much like its East Asian neighbours. So that's taken a short-term hit. But in the long run, it's again sitting, it's engaging with diplomacy, and it's of course watching carefully what's happening with the US. It's able to see in real time those defensive capabilities, able to see those interceptor missiles play out in real time, the impact of drones in modern warfare. These are all very important lessons for China's long-term strategic ambitions.
But I also think what we're seeing is a change in the basis of these relationships. As an alliance, you think in terms of common interest, common values, common systems of government. We're now in a period of be careful what you wish for. Trump is a very transactional leader. The Chinese are very transactional in terms of their foreign policy. That may well be the basis upon which future relationships are rooted, that it's no longer about common interest, it is about selective interest, and it'll all be something that has to be renegotiated issue by issue by issue, crisis by crisis by crisis.
It makes it a far more fluid situation, doesn't it, geopolitically? China's foreign ministry has spoken out about the war, specifically referring to the stability of the region.
The United States and Israel's military strikes against Iran without authorization from the UN Security Council violate international law. China is deeply concerned about the spread of war into neighboring countries. China believes that the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of the countries in the Gulf region should also be respected.
Forgive me for perhaps drawing a long bow here, Bradley, but would you infer that perhaps China would see an opportunity to step in and offer that security and stability in the Gulf region, given the issues they've had with offering that to the United States?
I think China remains deeply cautious about being involved in security entanglements. It usually relies on diplomacy or stepping in after conflicts to bring in its economic largesse, build up trade relationships, help in the reconstruction efforts. So I think China will likely take a very cautious approach to the region. It has to, of course, signal its commitment to Iran, which is a partner, but also it's important to remember that China has deep relationships with the Gulf states as well. In fact, those economic partnerships outnumber what it has with Iran, and so they're partnerships that really matter to China in the long run.
Just quickly before we go, I'll ask you both if the same question. Do you think the United States can repair its relationships with its allies before the end of the world? War, rather, I would say. Oh, goodness me. That was a faux pas.
I think you're closer by saying, can we repair these relationships? Yes.
Yes?
Is it going to take a long time? Yes.
All right, Bradley, last word to you.
Yes, I would definitely agree that I think that while there has been a lot of strain, there are still off-ramps to any long-term tensions.
Bradley Jardine, thank you so much. PJ Crowley, you too. All right, that rapidly shifting global diplomatic stage is also playing out online as commentators and decision makers grapple with the war in Iran. Alex Baird's been monitoring the debate.
Well, the war with Iran has changed the game. Trump at a fundraising dinner doing the rounds saying the US is now respected like never, ever before. But the clapback, he has no connection to reality.
We were a joke. All over the world, they were laughing at us, how stupid we were, how weak, how pathetic. Now we have the hottest country anywhere in the world.
Others saying the joke is that all Trump has done is lift oil sanctions on Russia and China, do over Ukraine and South Korea, insult Japan, and replace Khamenei with Khamenei. Podcaster Brian Allen with this damning critique. The Allies didn't abandon America. America spent a year telling them to leave. But the White House has been ripping that narrative apart, saying the US is constantly asked to help and gets very little in return. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth slamming not just our ungrateful allies in Europe, but the entire world, saying they
should be saying one thing to President Trump. Thank you.
A thank you for what Florida's Lieutenant Governor says is restoring order. When America leads with strength, our allies take notice and our adversaries think twice.
They're starting to put out nice things about the United States.
Zooming out, the analysis points to one thing. Everything has changed. Some say US security guarantees now look negotiable, and others that bullied and tariffed US partners now feel acutely insecure, while US adversaries, China and Russia, rub their hands. A very different world to that post-World War II order. And the question now, will that world be America first?
That's all from the team here in Washington, D.C. On This Is America, we'll keep following the decisions that shape the US and influence the world. If you want to catch up on this episode or previous ones, head to our website, aljazeera.com, or you can check out our YouTube channel. For now, let's head back to Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha.